Our next guest is a renowned historian, best-selling author with provocative answers to the big questions that face the world. Scottish-born Niall Ferguson's political and economic commentary is often described as contrarian. He'll be speaking at the Sydney Opera House this weekend as a guest of the Centre for Independent Studies, where he'll discuss what we've learnt from the GFC and whether the populist backlash against globalisation will propel Britain out of the EU and Donald Trump into the White House. Niall Ferguson joins us now. Thanks for being here, by the way.
Pleasure.
Now, history tells us, I'm quoting you here, that after a financial crisis there will be a populist backlash. Of course, the GFC was 8 years ago. Why has it taken so long?
Well, I remember being asked that question at the time, and I pointed out that there's usually a lag because in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, people are focused on the economic problems that they're confronted with. It's only after some years pass that they're able to really turn to politics and start to vent their frustrations. It's a little bit like the 1930s, but I think it's more like the 1870s and 1880s because these aren't really fascists, I think, in most cases. They're populists in the sense that this isn't a military movement, it's not about war, it's not about guys in uniforms beating people up. It's about a kind of backlash against globalisation, against immigration, which is obviously a hot topic, as we've just seen here, but it's true everywhere, against free trade, against free capital movements, and I think crucially, against corrupt political establishments. That's how they're widely seen. And the populists say, your problems, the reason that you got hammered economically a few years back is that there's an unholy alliance between political establishments and bankers. I think that's really the essence of populism.
But the irony is that in Britain and most of Europe and in the United States, economic conditions are actually improving at the same time this populist bandwagon is being jumped on.
Well, you know, politics is in some measure a luxury. Hanging on to a job, hanging on to your house, those are the things that people prioritise in the immediate post-crisis period. And it's in the recovery that people tend to turn to more radical politics. You know, the worst of the Depression was behind Germany when Adolf Hitler came to power. In the period of populism in the late 19th century, it was really in the 1880s and 1890s that populists actually started to come into legislatures to win elections. And that was quite a long time after the 1873 financial crisis. So I think it just takes time for people to get over the financial and economic shock and then say, you know what, I'd really like some payback here. And people in the United States have looked around and they don't see any bankers languishing in jail. There's a sense that people haven't been held to account.
It's strange, though, if you're against the elites, that you might turn to Donald Trump, who was born with a silver foot in his mouth.
Well, Trump has, in fact, mastered the art of addressing the common man, more the common man than the common woman, I'm afraid. What's striking about Trump is that although he comes from a wealthy background and has spent his whole life making millions, if not billions, in real estate, he does seem to have a knack of talking the language that the white, working class, non-college educated male can relate to. And I was very struck by this because early on in this campaign, when he was being written off by the likes of Arianna Huffington as, you know, someone who should be in the entertainment section, not the politics section, a New York cop said to me, having heard Trump, you know, Neil, he tells it like it is. And tells it like it is one of those key phrases. Trump does not use politically correct language. He doesn't talk like a regular politician. He says things that you would normally only hear in a bar. And I think that may have something to do with the time he's spent on building sites over the years. Being in the real estate business, you get to work with construction guys. And I think that's partly where Trump gets his ability to connect with the man in the saloon bar. None of the other guys after the Republican nomination could connect in that way. And it's really a formidable skill. Everybody underestimated him. They're still underestimating him.
Yeah, you don't underestimate him at all. I know from what you said.
I've learnt my lesson.
America has never been so ripe for tyranny. That's the headline in a highly regarded piece by Andrew Sullivan in the New York Magazine 2 weeks ago. Ripe for tyranny. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, the Founding Fathers tried to design the Constitution to deal with the problem that in classical political theory, republics tend to succumb to tyranny sometime or another. The majority votes for the demagogue promises them everything, and then he sweeps aside their liberties. So the Constitution's fairly well designed to prevent somebody like Donald Trump becoming a tyrant, seizing all the powers to himself. That's not been true of many constitutions in the Americas. Most Latin American constitutions didn't work, and tyrants came to power in nearly all those countries at one time or another. So I'm not sure I'm as pessimistic as Andrew, my old friend.
But he says, yeah, I know he's a friend of yours, he argues that polls have consistently misread the breadth of Trump's support from France to Britain to Germany, the polls have kept missing the power of right-wing insurgency.
Well, that is certainly right. I mean, the underestimation of Trump by the political class, all the people paid to comment on American politics got this crazily wrong. The supposed experts were wildly out. And people are still underestimating him. And if you look at the prediction markets, he has a 1 in 4 chance of winning the presidency. It has to be closer to 1 in 2. At this point, if you look closely at the mood of the country, I think this could be 50-50, the way things are going. Certainly in the popular vote, I think it might be harder for him to sew up the Electoral College. So we mustn't underestimate him. But I think that the difference between my view and Andrew's is that I think the Constitution is more robust than he suggests in that brilliant piece. That although Trump is promising to do a whole range of things, build a wall across the Mexican border, slap tariffs on China, ban Muslim immigration, on a whole range of issues, he will find himself up against Congress, where he's not necessarily going to have a great deal of traction, the Supreme Court. I mean, the separation of powers is a pretty smart idea to prevent the executive taking over. It will be in foreign policy, I think, that Trump can do the most mischief.
I mean, you've actually made the point the only type of war Donald Trump is threatening is trade war with China. What does China think of the prospect of a Trump presidency?
I've just been in Beijing for 2 weeks. I was really struck by the complacency there. Typical attitude you hear from people in Beijing is, well, he's a businessman. And American people say this kind of stuff in elections. So we can do a deal with him. I think they're underestimating the extent to which he has to deliver on at least some of these populist pledges if he wins, or he's a one-term president. And his own team make this very clear. Trump is going to act on at least some of these things. And I would imagine that on China, he will go in hard. It's also worth watching his stance on Russia. He said in his foreign policy speech a few weeks ago that he wanted to do, quote, a great deal with Putin. And I must say that rather froze my blood.
Do you think there could be a sort of personal allegiance or alliance between two men who actually have some things in common?
Well, it's a bromance in the sense that Putin has said that he admires Trump. I think they both specialise in a certain kind of macho politics. In some ways, Putin's the Russian populist who plays similar cards at home. Of course, he has the advantage that he's not really constrained by a constitution, and elections in Russia can be rigged. But I worry a lot about what Trump can do in foreign policy. I think he'll be much more hamstrung domestically should he win.
Well, I mean, you've publicly warned the world to stop underestimating Trump, arguing that he would be a dangerous player if he became president, a big global risk. What's the extent of that risk?
Well, considering that the world economy is still in a relatively fragile state, so much so that people are talking about secular stagnation even at the International Monetary Fund. The last thing we really need is a trade war between the two biggest economies in the world.
Because trade wars in the past, historically, have often led to shooting wars.
Well, or they've simply led to economic trouble. I mean, after all, tariffs were a source of economic instability in the late 19th century and in the 1930s. It's what populists do. They say, look, all your troubles are caused by foreigners. The Chinese are raping us, Trump says, meaning in terms of trade. A nonsense argument, actually, because the United States has benefited hugely from trade with China over the last 30 years. But the argument sort of resonates. Americans know that they are, in the case of the kind of average household, rather worse off than they were, say, 16 years ago. And what they hear from Trump is an explanation. He says the problem is globalization, meaning China, Mexico, meaning immigration, and corrupt politicians, meaning Hillary Clinton. And that explanation is really quite plausible to a lot of people. So we must not underestimate him and the trouble he could cause.
Niall Ferguson, we'll have to leave you there. We could obviously talk for hours on this subject. We'll try and do that again another time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tony.